Today, turn up my mic. Sounded real low. Today we're going to do The Enduring Mystery of Jack the Ripper by LEMMiNO. Just let me know. LEMMiNO. It's an hour and 9 minutes, so I'm going to break it down probably about 17 minutes and then call it. I'll go to chapter 4. So I'm just going to kind of, sorry, just started. Got my trusty rum and coke in hand. Oh, that's a perfect mix. I didn't put too much alcohol in that one. That's a good one. Oh yeah. We're gonna start this off right. Like and subscribe to the video if you want to see me drink more rum and cokes, which you should. Who wouldn't? Hope you have one. And words. Let's go ahead and start the video. By the way, there's a channel I watch called Vlogging Through History, and he did this video. I didn't watch it, but I saw it, and he's the one who got me onto the LEMMiNO. So I made sure I didn't watch it, but I want to watch his video after this, because I don't know, I used to love Jack the Ripper. It was just a fascinating thing, but I've kind of just gotten away from it as I got older.
In the late 19th century, the city of London was the largest in the world. A sprawling...
I paused it so that the internet could catch up to it. I'm hoping it's okay now.
Sprawling metropolis and a melting pot for trade, finance, and people. But in the autumn of 1888, an horrific story emerged from the capital's East End. A story so dreadful it sent shockwaves around the world. One after another, destitute women of the East End fell victim to a vicious killer known as Jack the Ripper. Despite an extensive manhunt and a few close calls, the Ripper was never caught. Instead, the murders came to an abrupt end and left behind one of the greatest mysteries in the annals of crime. In the East End of London, there's a district known as Whitechapel. In the late 19th century, Whitechapel was known for its overcrowded slums, where many of the capital's poor and unemployed had taken refuge. Day and night, an army of policemen would constantly patrol this labyrinthine network of dim-lit streets, courts, and alleys. One such place was a narrow passage known as George Yard. Near the north entrance of this passage was a residential complex known as George Yard Buildings. It was the morning of August the 7th, 1888, when an upstairs tenant named John Reeves headed out for work. Upon reaching the first floor landing, Reeves encountered the body of a woman lying upon her back in a pool of blood. Horrified by the sight, he stumbled down to the street below in search for help. Constable Thomas Barrett was the first officer on the scene. He was soon joined by Dr. Timothy Killeen, who conducted a brief examination. The woman had been stabbed 39 times, primarily in the chest and abdomen. Dr. Killeen estimated that she had been dead for, quote, about 3 hours, thus placing the time of death at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The woman had likely been attacked where she was found, as no blood was found beyond the staircase landing. But this was strange, as none of the tenants in this crowded building had heard a single cry for help or a disturbance of any kind. One exception was Amy Hewitt, a tenant who claimed to have heard a lone cry of murder. But this was early in the evening of August the 6th, and the scream had emanated from outside the complex. Hewitt further explained, "The district round here is rather rough, and cries of murder are a frequent, if not nightly occurrence." The victim was eventually identified as 30.
Can you imagine that kind of life? Where you're always in fear of being killed or mugged. I don't live in that kind of environment anymore. Not to be murdered, but there was a chance you could be shot, but definitely robbed, but not so much anymore. Like I'm far removed from that. But I just can't imagine that. It's just that's a horrible existence.
59-year-old Martha Tabrum. Tabrum was a mother of two and had separated from her husband many years prior. Her last known address was 19 George Street, a common lodging house less than 300 meters from the site of her death.
I'm loving this kind of animation here. This is really cool.
Tabrum had made a living through prostitution, and one of her associates was a woman named Mary Ann Connolly. Connolly testified that on the evening of August the 6th, she and Tabrum had been out drinking with two soldiers. Then, shortly before midnight, the party of four had separated. Connolly took her client into Angel Alley, while Tabrum guided hers into neighboring George Yard. It was the last time she saw Tabrum alive. Barely 2 hours later, Constable Barrett had spoken to a soldier loitering near the north entrance of George Yard. The soldier had told Barrett that he was, quote, waiting for his mate who had gone away with a girl. Half an hour later, Tabrum is presumed to have died. Both Connolly and Barrett were called upon to identify the soldiers, but all those accused could provide an alibi. One had been at home with his wife, another at an army base, and yet another in a completely different part of the city. This was enough for Inspector Edmund Reed, the lead investigator on the case, to abandon this line of inquiry. Connolly and Barrett.
I apologize for where my head is on the screen. I cannot move it. I have to restart, go into my program, and I can only move it here, 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 or I can make it bigger and it doesn't, the screen itself won't shrink any, so I apologize. Sorry guys. Links in the description so you can watch the video
having
yourself.
Both picked out the wrong men, they could not be trusted again as their evidence would be worthless. Even if a soldier had been responsible, no one could deduce a motive. The people of Whitechapel might have been accustomed to crime and violence, but the sheer brutality of this attack was as frightening as it was confounding. The crime is one of the most brutal that have occurred for some years. For a poor, defenseless woman to be outraged and stabbed in such a manner is almost beyond belief. These were the concluding remarks delivered at the final inquest held on August the 23rd. Only a week later, things would go from bad to worse.
This is an iPhone 11 Pro from Back Market. They specialize in refurbished devices that feel like new at secondhand pricing. Now, at Back Market, you can choose devices at different price points depending on their grade.
Sorry.
On the morning of August the 31st, a man named Robert Paul left his home on Foster Street and headed for work.
Sorry.
After making a right turn into Bucks Row, he spotted a man standing in the road. The man turned around to face him and said, "Come and look over here. There's a woman lying at the pavement." The stranger was named Charles Cross, and he too had been on his way to work when he first caught sight of the woman. The two men now cautiously approached. The woman's hands were cold to the touch, and Cross believed she was dead. Paul, however, thought he could sense faint breathing. But instead of seeking immediate help, Kris and Paul were more concerned about being late for work. As such, they quickly resumed their morning commute.
It's a different world.
Hoping to notify policemen along the way.
Not different world. Different time. Can't be late for work. Like, wouldn't even cross our minds today.
Fortunately, Constable John Neal was just around the corner. Neal was equipped with a lantern and found the woman lying on her back with a deep cut across the throat. The wound was still bleeding and parts of her body were still warm. He was soon joined by Constable John Thane, who was sent at once to fetch a nearby doctor. Upon his arrival, shortly after 4 o'clock, Dr. Reese Llewellyn estimated that, quote, she had not been dead more than half an hour. In other words, Kris and Paul had likely found the woman mere minutes after she was killed.
Okay.
Furthermore, 3 officers had patrolled the vicinity just a few minutes prior. Constable Neal had last inspected Bucks Row at approximately 3:15. So too had Sergeant Henry Kirby, whereas Constable Thane had merely passed the end of the street, none of whom had seen nor heard anything amiss. Upon the body's removal to the mortuary, a shocking discovery was made. Apart from 2 incisions in the throat, the woman had also been, quote, disemboweled. No organs had been removed, but Dr. Llewellyn found, quote, several incisions running across the abdomen. He also believed that the killer possessed, quote, some rough anatomical knowledge, for he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts. The victim was quickly identified. Her name was Marianne Nichols, and she had turned 43 just 5 days before the murder. Nichols had at least 6 children, and her last known address was a common lodging house at 56 Flower and Dean Street.
I saw one of her kids made it to the 1960s. 1962. And 15 years. So, wow. I was 15 years removed away from the child whose mom was killed by Jack the Ripper. I like to do weird things like that, to link myself to it. You ever do that?
On the night of her death, Nichols had been turned away from a lodging house on Thrall Street as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. Seeking to raise the money through prostitution, Nichols had then ventured down Osborne Street before meeting her friend, Ellen Holland. The two of them shared a brief exchange, but Nichols was visibly drunk. When they parted ways around 2:30, Holland saw Nichols staggering eastward along Whitechapel Road. Barely an hour later, she was found dead. Apart from the body itself, the killer had left nothing in their wake. No blood trail, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Inspector Joseph Helson, the lead investigator on the case, stated that, quote, not an atom of evidence can be obtained to connect any person with the crime. While the Nichols case ground to a screeching halt, its similarities with the Martha Tabrum case had not gone unnoticed. In both cases, the attack had been needlessly ferocious, and there was no discernible motive. Both victims were prostitutes of roughly the same age and moved in the same circles. The only meaningful difference was their injuries. Tabrum had been repeatedly stabbed, whereas Nichols had suffered multiple slash wounds. Differences aside, the prevailing assumption was that the same deranged individual had committed both murders. A conviction that would only grow stronger in the days that followed. As the sun was rising on September the 8th, a man named John Richardson was on his way to work. At 4:45, he made a quick stop at 29 Hanbury Street. He went through the entrance and out the back door by way of a cramped hallway. Richardson then sat down on the backyard steps before grabbing a knife to trim a vexing piece of leather from his boot. Once satisfied, he left the building and shut the front door behind him. About an hour later,
why would you walk through a building to go to a backyard to sit down and trim leather off of a boot? Why wouldn't you just sit down in the front? That makes sense to anyone else? Or was that a common thing? You didn't want to be seen cutting leather away from your boot? Just seems really odd to me. Am I the only one on this one? Why would you walk through a building to the back? Okay.
a third-floor tenant of the same address, John Davis, plodded downstairs and into the hallway. The front door was now wide open, but the one in the back was closed. When Davis went to open it, he found the bloodied remains of a woman lying on her back just below the steps. Inspector Joseph Chandler was the first officer on the scene. After a brief inspection, he sent at once for a medic. Dr. George Phillips arrived at 6:30 and found the woman, quote, terribly mutilated. The throat had been, quote, dissevered deeply, whereas the abdomen had been, quote, entirely laid open. The intestines had been, quote, lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse. The body was then conveyed to the mortuary, while Inspector Chandler and Dr. Phillips conducted a sweep of the backyard. Most of what they found belonged to the tenants of the building, but just below the resting place of the woman's feet, they found a small piece of cloth and 2 combs. The items had likely belonged to the victim, but it seemed to Dr. Phillips that they had been deliberately positioned and arranged by the killer. The post-mortem revealed that 2 brass rings had been forcefully removed from the victim's left hand. These rings were nowhere to be found. Portions of the victim's abdomen had also gone missing, including the womb. Dr. Phillips believed that, quote, the mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge. This point was greatly expanded upon at a subsequent inquest. The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room. The victim was quickly identified as Annie Chapman. Chapman's date of birth is a bit uncertain, but she was roughly 47 at the time.
Okay. So she had one child that died at 12, one that died the same year it was born, one that lived 27, 58, 5, 85 years. Same year, a year, same year, 66 years. Wow. I mean, only 2 kids really lives past 12. Jesus. That's why they were pumping out kids so much when they were, back in those days. She was 47. 5, 6, 7 kids. Damn.
Time of her death. She had at least 7 children, but was tragically only survived by 2. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. On the night of her death, Chapman had been denied accommodations as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. She was escorted off the premises by the night watchman, who then saw her vanish into a nearby alleyway. What happened to Chapman over the next few hours, nobody knows. Her whereabouts during this time is a complete mystery. But unlike the 2 previous cases, a witness in the Chapman case might have caught a glimpse of the killer. At 5:30 on the morning of September the 8th, a woman named Elizabeth Long spotted a man and a woman conversing outside 29 Hanbury Street. Long was positive that the woman she'd seen was Annie Chapman, but the man had stood with his back towards Long, so she never saw his face. Long did, however, manage to overhear a fragment of their conversation. The man had posed the question, "Will you?" to which the woman responded, "Yes." Now, a lasting point of contention in the Chapman case is the time of death. According to Dr. Phillips, when he arrived at 6:30, Chapman had been dead for, quote, "at least 2 hours." That would place her death at around 4:30. But according to Long, she saw Chapman alive a full hour later. Then there's the testimony of John Richardson. Richardson was the son of one of the tenants in the building. At 4:45, he made a routine checkup on the door to the basement.
He's the one I'm looking at.
Which had previously suffered a break-in. When he found it secure, he sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot. Even though he sat mere centimeters from the murder site, Richardson did not see a body. He was adamant on this point. "I could not have failed to notice the deceased if she had been there." To muddle the timeline even further, there's the testimony of Albert Kadosh. About 20 minutes past 5, Kadosh had gone through the backyard of 27 Hanbury Street when he heard voices coming from nearby. They were barely audible, however, and Kadosh had only made out the word "no." A few minutes later, he heard something falling against the wooden fence dividing the 2 yards. There's no one way to untangle this web of contradictions, but Dr. Phillips did concede the possibility that he'd miscalculated. That, quote, "the coldness of the morning and the great loss of blood" had skewed his opinion, which was largely based on the warmth of the body. So, presuming that Dr. Phillips did miscalculate, and the recollections of Long and Kadosh were off by a few minutes, that would place Chapman's death at around 5:30 in the morning. By this point, the dim light of dawn would have provided the tenants of 29 Hanbury Street an unobstructed view of the murder site, some of whom had even slept with their windows open. In spite of this, the killer managed to evade detection and even made time to arrange the victim's possessions. As the tally of victims gradually mounted, the public grew increasingly anxious. They were not only frightened by the murders, but frustrated with the police and their perceived incompetence. Even across the pond were the efforts of the police fiercely criticized. "The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world." What these
I can't say that if this were to happen in New York or in America, it might have been handled differently, but who knows? I mean, can't honestly tell you it would have been handled better or worse. So I understand, you know that they're obviously someone's gonna say something. It is what it is. But I think I don't know. I don't think that I could say that we would have been better in 1888.
Quotes and illustrations failed to capture were the overwhelming odds stacked in favor of the perpetrator. The police were up against someone who seemingly struck without motive, someone who left no murder weapon and few witnesses. On top of that, the East End was severely overcrowded, while the police were understaffed. As one newspaper put it, "A man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as invisible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses." At no point would this become more apparent than during the events of September the 30th.
Chapter 4, we're going to end it here. I gotta make a new one because I'm going to keep filming. But I gotta finish this one for you. Man, I made a delicious one. In the next video, part 2, you'll figure out if I made another delicious one or if I put too much alcohol in it, which I'm prone to do because I put a lot of ice in there before I mix it. And then fill it up. You don't care. None of you care. None of you cares about me. Why do you care? None of you cares about me. Alright, I'm going to end this here, and I almost hit the wrong button. I'm not drunk. And I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. This is a pretty good channel. I'm loving the stuff. By the way, I keep peeking over because I'm checking out the news. Heat advisories and all that kinds of stuff. I apologize. I am paying attention. I can still hear. But, sorry. Just realized I got glue on my hand from work. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and end it. And have a good day. Have a good night.